One. All right. Hello, everybody. I am the newly minted Reverend Gordon Tubbs, and joining me today is my friend Janelle. Janelle, could you introduce yourself and tell the world a little bit more about yourself and what you do for a living?
Well, I'm just so happy to be here with you, Gordon. You've been such a great friend and a light in my life. And I am a trauma-informed therapist, an author, adjunct professor, specializing in family systems and just helping men, women, and their families come into their true potential and purpose.
Awesome. And you're also a published author, yes?
Yeah, getting ready to publish my third book. I'm so excited. Stronger every day.
Okay.
That'll be coming out in January.
All right. Well, our topic for today is suicide ideation prevention strategies, aka SIPs. And so, just to give you a couple disclaimers, we are not professionals insofar as someone who might pick up the hotline when you call the National Suicide Hotline Network. We are not trained to talk you off of a ledge, so to speak. So if you are in a crisis right now, I would encourage you to call 911, call 1-800-273-8255, or text TALK to 741-741. Again, our intended audience for this conversation is going to be a Christian one. So we want to provide our perspectives as Christians who are in a healing role, who do ministry, who are in the therapy counseling environments. So we're going to assume that you, the person watching this conversation, are kind of sitting on the couch, as it were. And we want to talk you through just some basic ideas and perspectives and some tools perhaps that we can equip you with to help blow away the dark clouds that are in your life. So let's just dig right into the big fat question. So suicide, what is it? How can we respond to it? I have a quote from Albert Camus that I wanted to share. This is a famous French philosopher, also an atheist. He wrote The Myth of Sisyphus. And in that, he says this: there is only one really serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Deciding whether or not life is worth living is to answer the most fundamental question in philosophy. All other questions follow from that. So Camus, in writing this book, Myth of Sisyphus, had this image that I will pull up here, of Sisyphus. And he saw Sisyphus, or typically our interpretation of the Sisyphus story is one of absurdity. That you have this guy who is pushing a big stone up a hill, and then the stone rolls down the hill, and he has to get up and roll the stone back up the hill, rinse and repeat. And I think Camus wanted to I hone in on that image and use that as perhaps an analogy for how life presents itself to us sometimes. We're caught up in these motions that seem very recursive and repetitive, and they eventually degrade us and demean us. And Camus's solution to that, was to get this: imagine Sisyphus having the time of his life. So he said, well, what if we just pictured Sisyphus as enjoying rolling the stone uphill for the pure joy of pushing it up there? And all of a sudden, that mental model that we have of Sisyphus being crushed under the weight of this stone is changed. Um, and I wanted to present actually a different mental model as a response to Sisyphus, which is maybe we let the stone go.
Hmm.
And imagine Sisyphus letting the stone go so that he can get to the top of the mountain and enjoy the view.
Yeah.
So, with that mental model in mind, I hope that we can move forward into this conversation safely with grace, and we can help get to the top of that hill that's in your life, that we can help you roll the stone away. And I think to do that, we need to define our terms and see our starting position and all that. So the definition that we're going to work with of suicide is ending one's life. It's very simple. My dad, a clinical psychologist, defines it as a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And we know that suicide affects everybody. There's no one who's immune to it. Some recent suicides include Anthony Bourdain, Kate Spade, and we also have people in the military who tragically they end their lives at a rate of 22 a day, as we're told. And
Wow.
you think, people who are trained to fight for a living, who are instilled with core values and so forth, would be the most resilient among us, and yet they are at the highest risk of actually ending their life. And so we're going to explore why that might be the case. And so, Janelle, I'd like to turn it over to you. Maybe you can talk to us about how suicide ideation originates in us, and how that cycle begins.
Well, I think a very underestimated, misunderstood piece of suicide puzzle could be that someone has some childhood trauma that has been left unresolved. We add to the conversation moral trauma, we add spiritual trauma, any trauma, little t, middle T, big T. Trauma is basically anytime emotions or feelings or circumstances are just too big for your body. Gordon, you and I have talked a lot about the military before today, and my dad was a Marine, and I can remember as a 12-year-old little girl being told after he got home from Vietnam that he had jumped out of his hospital bed thinking he was in a foxhole. And split his head open. And they didn't know much about PTSD back in those days. I'm a wee bit older than you. And so I think that as a therapist and a trauma-informed therapist, and having come into understanding the role of trauma a little bit later in my therapeutic work, I think it's a huge missing piece. That, when I see that big stone, right, I think, wow, a lot of us are pushing a stone up a mountain like that, and we don't even know what it is and why we're so tired. And so I think it's a real something I pound the table over in my own work and in my writings and in my teaching, is to help try to inform the Christian church, the body, pastors, leaders, lay ministers, about the role of mental health and the role of trauma in our healing process. So I just think it's something we need to pay attention to, and we need to be informed about it so that we can better meet the needs of the people that we're serving and helping.
Right. And, there's that famous expression, hurt people hurt people.
We do. It's generational on so many sides. The third, the sins of the father are passed on to the third, the fourth generations. And, there's a lot to be said about generational trauma and emotion being stored in our DNA. We could go on for a long time about that, but it's in the light of suicide, in light of the topic that we have on the table today, I think we just need to be more alert and more aware, especially those of us in a leadership role, and those of us who are serving in a healing profession or ministry capacity, that we're more aware and alert and informed about some of the signals that people may be presenting to us.
Right. So on that note of signals, often there's a lot of noise, and it's hard to get that signal to noise ratio tuned in. But one tool that I think is helpful is that of cognitive behavioral therapy. And, this approach presents us with a good way to kind of discern the signal from the noise by looking at attitudes, thoughts, and behaviors, not as a linear sort of diagram, but more so as a cycle, as a system. And so this idea of attitudes, thoughts, and behaviors working together, how that pans out in practice is that we may find ourselves fixated on some sort of an idea, a thought, and our fixation on that thought will eventually change our attitudes and it will eventually change our behaviors. Likewise, if we change our behaviors in doing something, say we decide to wake up every morning at 6 a.m., well, eventually that is going to impact our attitudes and thoughts.
Mhm.
And then going to attitudes themselves, our self view, our beliefs about ourselves, um, our sort of mindset that we have for that day, that will also impact our thought processes and behaviors. And so, Janelle, I was hoping maybe to get your perspective on this cycle of attitudes, thoughts, and behaviors. How do you weave that into a therapeutic setting with respect to um, getting people to do some sort of a change? Because I think
Mhm.
that's something that um, I don't want to overlook is that, the point of recognizing this cycle is to recognize that change needs to happen and that we need to
Yeah.
change one of those things to change the other. So how do you use that cycle?
Well, it's everything, right? It's our feedback loop. There are different ways you can describe that cycle, the memory complex, feedback loops, positive, negative. The foundation of the work that I do is I've put together what I call the threefold cord of a healthy sense of self. That's our identity, our essence, our who we are, who God breathed his breath into us to be, right? Genesis 2:7. And then healthy behavior patterns and healthy communication skills. So the key there is healthy, 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 healthy. And we have within our capacity the ability to choose healthy or unhealthy. We may call that self-destructive behaviors, right? Or we might call it self-sabotaging or sabotaging. We might just call it toxic. There are many ways to call it. I just like to say it simply. I can either have healthy thoughts or unhealthy thoughts. But underneath that, Gordon, we have to get to the root, right? We have to understand, why am I thinking the way I think? Why do I say the things I say? And why do I treat myself the way I treat myself? Or why do I let other people treat me the way they do?
Mhm.
So we begin at the beginning, and that to me is Genesis 2:7, coming back to understand who God breathed his life into me to be. And so, then we move into systems, and that's why I love family systems, because we were nurtured in a system,
Yeah.
whatever that system might be. And so we might come into the world with God's breath living in us, but then we have other voices and other people putting their voices and their stamp on our life. So we have to understand why we think the way we think. What are the limiting beliefs in my life? Like, I'm just not good enough.
Hmm.
I can't do that. Or, a really good one within the Christian worldview is, I should do this, right? Shouldology. We should all over each other. I should do this. I should do that. So there are lots of, we have beliefs. And in my next book, a big part of that work that I do is transforming metanoia, changing limiting beliefs into living water beliefs. Oh, I'm so sorry. I had that cut off. I'm so sorry. Um,
Welcome back to the show.
I'm so sorry. So we want to we want to transform limiting beliefs that are keeping us oppressed, keeping us down, so that we can receive the truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
So I wanted to share a story about this um, self-limiting belief thing. And the point of this story is to show how there could be beliefs that they might have a very positive origin story, but downstream they don't lead to flourishing. And
yeah,
this, nothing against my parents. I love them. They provided a very loving household that I grew up in. But something that I was told as a kid was to, or more so as a teenager, was to not pursue music as a career. I had this dream of going to um, Full Sail University, of getting in a band, becoming a producer, going on tour, all of that stuff. And my mom, unfortunately, I think she had tried to do that earlier in her life, and it didn't pan out. And so I think she wanted to steer me away from going down that path of going into a musical career, and to do something that was more tangible and concrete that I could put my hands on and make a decent wage. And that was great wisdom. My parents were trying to steer me away from potential failures. They didn't want to see me wind up in the same ditches that they wound up in, and I love them for that. Um, but I think my story might resonate with a lot of people who had parents who, at some point in their childhood, told them that they couldn't do something,
that's correct. Yeah.
and that you can't do that voice rang with so much authority that we internalized it. And now all of a sudden, that's impacting my attitudes, thoughts, and behaviors
Yes.
in a way that, if I were to turn to the Bible, I would clearly read in scripture, time after time of God saying, fear not, go for this. This is my vision for you. I have plans for you. It's like, listen to my voice so that
Yeah.
I can take you to the finish line. Don't listen to anyone else. And so I think we have to recognize that sometimes, these um, self-destructive or self-limiting attitudes, thoughts, and behaviors often have, real positive origin stories,
Yeah.
but they may not, they may actually be hurting us in the long term.
Yes.
Um,
Or
and
limiting us. And
yeah,
so, there are good limits and there are bad limits, or healthy or
right,
unhealthy, right? And what I have tried to embrace in my life is to really understand John 10's context of knowing the voice of my Father, knowing the voice, the one true voice, and tried to instill that in my own three children. Is there are going to be so many voices in this world, and
right,
especially today when we are connected 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There are just so many voices. And some of them are good-hearted voices, like your parents. Um, they're trying to steer you the right way. But is it the one true way for your life? And so when I think in context of our topic of suicide, I've known so many families that have had to endure someone they love committing suicide, and there typically is that echo in all of the stories of they were confused, or there was just so many voices, they felt so much pressure, they felt this, they da da da. We have to be able to train others and identify that one true voice in our life, and silence all of the other ones, and so that we can truly live out our God-breathed identity, as I say, or our true essence. Yeah, that's a very good story. I think it's very helpful. Yeah.
and I think, going back to this idea of recognizing the signals, we have sometimes, these self-destructive behaviors or sabotaging behaviors, toxic behaviors. They'll manifest in different ways that don't appear to be suicidal
Right.
on their face, but over a long period of time, what's lurking beneath the surface may in fact lead to suicidal attitudes and thoughts, and hopefully not a behavior. Um, So I think by recognizing these signals, we can kind of see where they originated and then find out at what point did a limit come into our life or a trauma come into our life,
Mhm.
and try to unpack that more. But
Right.
just to move on, there's another approach that I wanted to offer called dialectical behavioral therapy, and this is rooted in the Socratic method, which really consists of asking the question why over and over and over until you get to a satisfactory answer. And so, with respect to using the Socratic method when it comes to um, suicidal thoughts and attitudes, I wanted to start by asking the question, and this is a question I asked myself many years ago, is why do I want to get up in the morning? And I thought about that for a long time. And my first inclination was, well, I have class, or well, I have work, or I have things to do. And then I really thought that those are sort of superficial answers to that question. They weren't really getting at the why. And so I thought about it more, and I came to this insight that the reason why, and you're gonna love this, the reason why I get up in the morning is because I don't want to pee on myself.
Goodness.
And that sounds very vulgar. But even that still, I think, helped me obtain another insight when I asked myself, why don't I want to pee on myself? And there, I think I found what I call my spark, which is I don't want to pee on myself because I respect myself. And the reason why I get up in the morning is because I respect myself enough to get up in the morning. And I respect myself to go to the bathroom, to step into the shower, to get a cup of coffee, to have breakfast. And I respect myself enough to do those things because I kind of respect my life. And
Yeah.
I respect the opportunity and moments that I've been given to live it out. And so, Janelle, I was hoping I could, in sharing that story, I was hoping maybe you could uh, talk about um, how our self-talk really informs us when it comes to our day-to-day um, actions and stuff.
Well, if you would allow, I'd love to share a I've never shared this out loud, but I'm feeling like I ought to do this.
Okay, let's go for it.
I know. I'm going to do it. So, you just shared a beautiful, very practical, but yet very important Socratic way of going, like, why, go deeper, why, right? Okay. And so, as you and I have been talking, and I have been had many, many times in my life, many thoughts, processes, many feedback loops in my life that why I just want to die. I'm just,
Mm,
I just, I just, I just want to die. And that's a scary place to be. And I've really never shared this publicly ever. But I feel like it's appropriate. And my mother just passed away a month ago.
mm,
And so I think that I can share it now with her blessing, from things that we talked about before her passing, about my story, her story, our story. But when my mother was pregnant with me, my father was having an affair,
mm.
and my mother had two other children, 7 and 8 years old. But she always would say, the day you were born was the loneliest day of my life.
Wow,
And I heard that many, many times.
wow.
And until I probably a few years ago, honestly, when I have been really able to process and understand more about my own childhood trauma, having grown up in the family of an alcoholic military family. So, like I said, my dad with PTSD, undiagnosed, that kind of thing. I think that I came to understand that's where I was talking, that generational trauma, or that, she was experiencing such deep loneliness and deep sorrow while pregnant with me, and then birthing me into a place where my dad had already been transferred to Hawaii. And at that time in my life, Hawaii was an annexed, I couldn't go there until I was 8 weeks old. So he went ahead of us. So once again, then I had not met my dad probably till I was 12 weeks old. So as I had looked at my own past, and I'm sharing this to show that feedback loop, that then it was subconscious. It was in my, deep in my subconscious that, well, why was I ever even born? If I'm going to cause such loneliness, if I'm going to cause such sadness in somebody, why was I born? And then as life would go on and I excelled in certain ways, people would get jealous or and I just go, well, why was I even born? Because I just cause trouble wherever I go. So I think that is the power of attuned helpers, attuned ministers, attuned people like myself in the therapy, attuned friends. I just use the word people who are really aware of listening between the lines of people's stories, that we can begin to offer to people true change. Right. Does that make sense? Does that make, when we begin, and this is what I am so passionate about, when we begin bringing into the faith world an understanding of the power of the brain and our mental health, when we can begin to really understand the synergy of mental health, emotional health, and spiritual health, we're going to see real, true transformation occur. And I think that's why we're here today.
Yeah.
Trying to start conversations about how we can be more effective in helping people to resolve perhaps anything inside of them that is not resolved, that we're not even conscious of.
Yeah, because it may sound trite right now, and thank you so much for sharing that story. That was incredible. And it may sound trite in saying this, but I don't believe that suicide is an accident that happens to you. It's not something that you get hit by a car, that's an accident. Well, if somebody ends their own life, that's not an accident. Like something happened, something got this train rolling that led to that moment where somebody ended their life.
And we're beginning to know with epigenetics, which is the study of generational trauma and inherited trauma, we're beginning to understand that more and more, Gordon. It's becoming, a reality that a lot of the things that we do in our lives are inherited and embodied in our DNA. And so I think that's the mystery of suicide on so many accounts. So many people I know go like, what? Anthony Bourdain, he had everything.
Yeah.
Kate Spade had everything, right? But we only saw the surface of their lives, which is what we live in today on all of our social media platforms, and their stories deeply affected me to listen closer to my friends that are around me, who may appear to have everything and who may appear, to have it all together, but truly do any of us. So it's a charge to all of us to equip and empower not only ourselves, but those within our spheres of influence to be better friends and better listeners and better moms and better dads. And
well, I think on that note of seeing how our lives are actually part of something bigger than ourselves, I wanted to move into our last approach for today, which is really to kind of see our lives and the whole world as existing inside of a narrative that has plot points, and there's a genre, and there are characters and so forth. And I know all the English and, British lit
The
folks,
hero's journey.
yeah, they're going to love this approach. But, for the engineering math types,
Yes.
that are hearing this, I think you could take it to another level of thinking about your life as having a blueprint, or
Yeah.
as I've shared recently with my youth, who are going back to school. I asked them, it's like, do you think your teacher has a plan for you when you walk into the classroom? And everybody, of course, raised their hand. Yes. It's like, well, God, our great teacher, Jesus, the great teacher, probably has a plan for us. And if we think about our lives as being one big classroom where we have opportunities to
Love it.
learn,
Love
then
it.
we can pay attention to the teacher, and we can pick up on these cues. And so, whether or not you're an English person or a math person, I think,
Or
having,
a musician.
yeah, I think, having this approach that um, things can ultimately be simplified to a narrative, I think is extremely helpful. And uh, I think, to kind of maybe add a caveat, when we're talking about suicide, um, is I would define that in literary terms as a premature ending to a story that was just getting interesting.
Yes. I'd love,
Yeah.
read that again. Say it again.
Yeah. So suicide is a premature ending to a story that was just getting interesting.
Yes. Just getting started. Right.
Yeah. And my wife and I, we were watching an old movie last night. It was the greatest game ever played. It was the Harry Vardon, Francis Ouimet story.
Oh, lovely.
And in this movie, Francis Ouimet gives up golf for a time, and the local club owner comes into this golf shop and and asks him, like, why did you stop playing the game? And he asked him, how old are you, son? And he said, 20 years old. He said, that's too young to give up on your dream.
Yes. Yes.
And so likewise, I think, um, when we look at suicide as a premature ending, what we're saying is we're denying ourselves the opportunity of having a third act
Yeah.
where we can find redemption. And when I look at the whole story of humanity, um, I see our narrative genre as being a tragedy, to be blunt.
Mhm.
I don't think we live in a drama. We don't live in a comedy where everything's happy.
Right.
Um, we really live in a tragic, fallen world, and that's our collective narrative, right? And
Yes.
so I think that when we assume that narrative in our lives, I think we can actually find Christ in the middle of it, because Christ he's that second act person who stepped in and said, hey,
Yes.
on this day I can change the third act if you just let me into your life.
That's beautiful.
um, and that's the story, I think, as Christians, that we can really affirm, is that, no matter how bad life is, even when we feel like ending the story, um,
Yes.
we have to realize that there are so many more chapters in our story that are left to tell. And it may be hard,
Well, I
but
think if I could interrupt just for a second, I think
yeah, go.
one beautiful thought about that is that everything we're saying here comes down to relationships, right? So suicide is often people feeling isolated or feeling lonely or feeling no sense of purpose or just confused. There's a myriad of reasons. Many of them are mysterious and make no sense. But what Jesus did when he came in is he offered himself to us, that we could have a friend and a, he, a relationship that's so deep and so intimate. And for me, I lost that in the traditions of church and religion, religious systems and those types of things. And so we want to once again come back to that first love that he talks about in Revelations in the churches. Come back to me, come back to your first love. Come back and follow Jesus within the community of faith, but it not be based on shoulds and oughts and limiting beliefs and you can't do this and you can do this. Just immerse ourselves in a relationship with a very real person named Jesus, who is an ever-present help to us every day of our life. And so I just wanted to add that he's driving our story and he's walking us through every aspect of our story. But sometimes we get lost in that. And, we want to understand why we get lost. Do we get lost in the system? What do we get lost in?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, if I could have some dead air for just a brief moment, I wanted to pull up this diagram which we're kind of talking about, but it is the hero's journey diagram.
Yes.
And this was Joseph Campbell's insight, and a lot of people don't know this, but George Lucas basically wrote Star Wars off of this diagram.
Yeah.
Of course, he was deeply influenced by a lot of samurai movies and Western movies growing up. But when it came time to actually write the story itself, he looked at Campbell's hero's journey diagram. And you can always, you can see it right here. We have Luke Skywalker, right?
Yes.
His call to adventure. He gets supernatural aid from Obi-Wan Kenobi. And his threshold is blowing up the Death Star. He has this great challenge in his life where his mettle is tested and he has to find out what he is made of. And I think as Christians, I would say we sometimes need to put ourselves in environments and domains where our mettle is tested.
For sure.
So that we can find out who made us.
That's correct. Yes.
And so I don't want to belabor the diagram, but I think when we look at this hero's journey cycle and we think of that as playing, as being indicative, or I should say, as that, being a model that we can use to describe our own lives, then I think we're going to have some powerful insights from that. And I think one of the insights comes from Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. I'm probably butchering that name, but
yes, I can't help you there.
Yeah, he's a Jesuit Catholic priest, and he said this: "We are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience."
Yes.
So I wanted to maybe use that quote in closing here as we wrap up, to basically tell you, our dear listener and viewer, that you are a spiritual being.
Yeah.
And God has a plan for you to give you hope and to prosper you. And we started this conversation by looking at Sisyphus, this guy pushing the stone uphill. And I asked you to think about letting the stone roll away. So now I ask you to think about the man who rolled the stone away in real life. And that is our risen Lord Jesus Christ. In him, we have all of our hopes and dreams fulfilled, and we can find peace in his embrace. So, Janelle, do you have any closing thoughts for us today?
Just to remember that he is closer than a brother, our Jesus that we're talking about, and that he is always present in your life, even when it feels like he's not. And I would just admonish you, charge you, invite you, encourage you you may not even know where to begin on that. Like, how do I have this relationship with Jesus? Or, maybe you've been in a relationship with him for 40 years and for decades. Just today would be the day. I always like to say, today is your day. Today is your day.
Yeah.
No matter what stone you are rolling up that hill, no matter how big that stone is, that rock, that boulder, just sit, get quiet, and invite him in and talk to him. He's very close to you, and he wants to hear you. That's what I would want to say.
Thanks, Janelle.
You're so welcome. This was
Great.
awesome.
Yeah, it's a great conversation. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. If you have anything for Janelle, she's open, available, or you can contact me and I'll put you in touch with her. But thank you so much.
Please reach out.
Yes.
You hear us? Reach out. If you're seeing this and it's resonating with you and you feel alone, or you feel like there's so many voices, reach out. We're here to help.
Amen. Amen. All right, friends, that's us. Briefly, once more, before I wrap things up.
Yes.
The hotline, 1-800-273-8255, and the text line that you can text TALK to 741-741. Those are 24/7 available resources for you. So if you are in a crisis right now, please give one of those numbers a call.
Please.
If you're not in a crisis right now, then just reach out. We're here, and we hope that you have a blessed day, and we'll see you sometime later. Ta-ta.
Ta-ta.